Picture a hospital room in Montreal, 1957. The walls are thick, institutional grey. A woman in her 30s lies in a bed, her eyes vacant, staring at nothing. Headphones cover her ears, and from them comes a voice, her own voice, recorded weeks ago, repeating the same phrase over and over again. You are weak. You are selfish. You are weak. You are selfish. The message loops endlessly. 16 hours a day, punctuated by electroshock treatments powerful enough to erase memory. This woman came here seeking treatment for postpartum depression. She will leave unable to recognize her own children. She will have to be toilet trained again like an infant. Her husband will find a stranger in his home, a hollow shell where his wife once lived. And this was not the work of some rogue monster operating in darkness. This was funded by the American Central Intelligence Agency, approved at the highest levels, conducted by respected doctors at prestigious universities. This was MKUltra. The story of MKUltra is not simply about drugs and experiments. It's about fear so profound it twisted the soul of a nation. It's about power unchecked by accountability. It's about the human capacity for rationalization when confronted with uncomfortable truths. And most importantly, it's about what happens when governments decide that some citizens are expendable in the name of national security. The experiments spanned 2 decades, involved over 150 subprojects, countless institutions, and destroyed lives across 3 continents. Most of the records were deliberately destroyed in 1973, making a full accounting impossible. What we know is horrifying. What we don't know might be worse. To understand how America arrived at this dark place, we need to step back to the years immediately following World War II. The planet exhaled after the Nazi defeat, but the peace was fragile, almost illusory. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, forged in the fires of shared combat against fascism, was already cracking. By 1947, the Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. In Winston Churchill's famous phrase, the world was dividing into 2 armed camps, each convinced of its righteousness, each terrified of the other's intentions. This was the birth of the Cold War, and with it came a new kind of conflict. It wasn't fought primarily on battlefields, though there would be those too. It was fought in shadows, in the minds of populations, in the corridors of power, where decisions were made away from public scrutiny. The Americans had emerged from the war as a superpower, their industrial might unmatched, their military undefeated. But that strength came with a peculiar vulnerability. The Soviets had the bomb now. The nuclear monopoly had lasted only 4 years. American cities were suddenly as vulnerable as Moscow or Leningrad. And there was something else, something harder to quantify, but perhaps more unsettling. The communists seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to make people believe. The Moscow show trials of the 1930s had featured confessions so elaborate, so self-abasing, that they defied rational explanation. Loyal Bolsheviks, men who had stood with Lenin himself, had stood before the world and confessed to being fascist agents, to plotting assassination, to betraying everything they'd spent their lives building. They'd done so calmly, methodically, as though reading from a script. How? The question haunted Western intelligence services. Was there some technique, some drug, some method that could strip away free will and remake a human mind? The fear intensified with events in Eastern Europe after the war. Cardinal Józef Mindszenty, the Catholic primate of Hungary, was arrested in December 1948. When he appeared at his trial 2 months later, he seemed transformed. His eyes were glazed, his manner subdued. He confessed to treason, to plotting to restore the monarchy, to collaborating with Western intelligence. He spoke in a flat monotone, as though the words were being pulled from him by invisible wires. CIA officials watched newsreels of the trial with growing alarm. They saw a man who appeared to have been fundamentally altered, his personality seemingly erased and rewritten. If the communists could do this to a cardinal, a man of fierce will and deep conviction, what might they do to American prisoners of war? What might they do to CIA agents captured behind enemy lines? The possibilities were nightmarish. These fears crystallized during the Korean War. The conflict began in June 1950 when North Korean forces, backed by Stalin and Mao, poured across the 38th parallel. American troops, poorly prepared for war on the Asian mainland, found themselves in brutal combat in the mountains and valleys of the Korean peninsula. By autumn, Chinese forces had entered the war, sending waves of soldiers against UN positions in sub-zero temperatures. Americans were captured by the hundreds, then by the thousands. They were marched north through the freezing Korean winter to prison camps along the Yalu River. Many died on these death marches from cold, from starvation, from disease. Those who survived found themselves in a new kind of prison camp, one designed not just to contain them, but to transform them. The Chinese implemented what they called lenient policy toward prisoners. It was anything but lenient. Prisoners were subjected to endless political education sessions, forced to listen to hours of lectures about Marxist-Leninism, about American imperialism, about the supposed crimes of their own government. They were required to write self-criticisms, confessing to thought crimes and bourgeois attitudes. Those who cooperated received small rewards, extra food, lighter work details. Those who resisted were isolated, starved, subjected to psychological torture that could break the strongest will. Sleep deprivation, forced standing, temperature extremes, the threat of execution hanging over everything. It was systematic, methodical, designed to wear down resistance not through direct violence but through constant, grinding psychological pressure. And it worked, to a degree that shocked American military officials. When prisoners began to be repatriated in 1953, after the armistice, many exhibited disturbing changes. Some had signed peace petitions. Others had participated in propaganda broadcasts denouncing their own country. A few had even made confessions to biological warfare, claiming they had dropped plague and anthrax on North Korean civilians, accusations that were entirely false, but delivered with conviction. Most disturbingly, 21 American soldiers and 1 British soldier refused repatriation entirely, choosing to remain in communist China rather than return home. The American public was stunned. These were American boys, raised in American homes, educated in American schools. How could they have been turned so completely? The term brainwashing entered the American vocabulary almost immediately. It was coined by Edward Hunter, a journalist who was also working for the CIA's propaganda wing, writing in a Miami newspaper in 1950. The word was a direct translation of the Chinese "si nao," which referred to the thought reform programs the communists had been implementing since their victory in the Chinese Civil War. Hunter described brainwashing as an almost mystical Oriental technique, something alien and incomprehensible to Western minds. It was, he suggested, a form of psychological warfare more powerful than any weapon. In his telling, the communists had discovered a way to literally rewrite human consciousness, to strip away individuality and replace it with robotic obedience. The reality was less dramatic but no less troubling. What the Chinese were doing wasn't magic. It was a systematic application of psychological pressure based on principles that Western psychologists understood perfectly well. The behaviorist school, exemplified by B.F. Skinner's work with rats and pigeons, had demonstrated that behavior could be shaped through carefully applied rewards and punishments. Even Pavlov's experiments with dogs had shown how conditioned responses could be created through association. The human mind, in this view, was not some inviolable fortress, but a mechanism that could be manipulated if you understood the right techniques. The communists, it seemed, had taken these principles and applied them with ruthless efficiency to human subjects. If they could do it, couldn't America? This was the context in which Allan Welsh Dulles rose to power in the American intelligence community. Dulles was a Princeton man, class of 1914, a lawyer by training who had found his calling in espionage during World War II with the Office of Strategic Services. He was urbane, well-connected, brilliant, and utterly convinced of American exceptionalism. In 1951, he became Deputy Director of Plans for the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, effectively running all covert operations. 2 years later, his brother, John Foster Dulles, would become Secretary of State under Eisenhower, giving the Dulles brothers extraordinary influence over American foreign policy. Allan Dulles believed that the Cold War was a zero-sum game, that the very survival of the Western way of life depended on matching and exceeding Soviet capabilities in every arena, no matter how dark. On April 10, 1953, Dulles gave a speech to Princeton alumni that would set the stage for one of the most notorious programs in CIA history. His words were carefully chosen, designed to sound both principled and alarming. "We in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare," he declared. He spoke of Soviet techniques as abhorrent and nefarious, ways of twisting the human mind that violated fundamental American values. But then came the turn. Despite these moral qualms, Dulles suggested, America could not afford to fall behind. The communists, he argued, were waging a battle for men's minds, and the stakes were too high to surrender the field. Just 3 days after this speech, on April 13, 1953, Allan Dulles formally approved the creation of a new program. It was given the cryptonym MKUltra. The MK prefix designated it as a technical services staff project. Ultra signified its ultra-sensitive nature. This program would search for methods of mind control, for ways to influence human behavior through drugs, hypnosis, isolation, and other means. It would operate in complete secrecy, with minimal oversight, funded through channels that obscured its true purpose, and it would be placed under the direction of a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was born in the Bronx in August 1918, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants. His childhood was marked by two afflictions that shaped his character. He was born with a club foot, which excluded him from military service during World War II, and he developed a severe stutter that made communication difficult. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, he excelled academically. He studied agricultural biology and chemistry, eventually earning a doctorate in biochemistry from California Institute of Technology. His doctoral thesis was on ascorbic acid in cowpeas, about as far from intelligence work as one could imagine, but the war changed many destinies, and Gottlieb's expertise in chemistry brought him to the attention of government recruiters. By 1951, Gottlieb was working for the CIA's Technical Services Staff, the division responsible for developing spy gadgets, secret weapons, and unconventional methods for covert operations. He was exactly the kind of person Allan Dulles needed for MKUltra: brilliant, methodical, and possessed of a peculiar moral flexibility that allowed him to rationalize almost anything in the name of national security. Gottlieb lived a life of studied contradictions. He and his wife Margaret raised goats at their cabin in rural Virginia, which had no electricity or running water. He meditated. He practiced folk dancing. He considered himself deeply spiritual. Yet at work, he designed suicide pills, poison dart guns, and methods for destroying human minds. In his own view, there was no contradiction. He was a patriot, serving his country in its hour of need. The communists, he believed, had no such scruples. They would use any weapon, exploit any weakness. America had to match them or perish. When Gottlieb took control of MKUltra in 1953, the program inherited ongoing research from its predecessors, Projects Bluebird and Artichoke. These earlier programs had already been experimenting with drugs and interrogation techniques, but on a limited scale. MKUltra would be different. It would be massive, comprehensive, and utterly ruthless in its pursuit of results. Gottlieb's first major decision was to focus on a substance that had recently captured the attention of the intelligence community: lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as LSD. The drug had been synthesized in 1938 by Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist working for Sandoz Laboratories. Hofmann had accidentally ingested a tiny amount in 1943 and experienced the first acid trip, a bicycle ride home through Basel, during which reality seemed to melt and reform around him. The experience was profound, terrifying, and utterly unlike anything produced by other drugs. By the early 1950s, word of LSD's extraordinary psychoactive properties had reached the CIA. Here was a substance that could profoundly alter consciousness, with doses measured in micrograms. It produced hallucinations, paranoia, a complete dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. What if it could be weaponized? What if you could dose an enemy diplomat before a crucial negotiation, leaving him confused and suggestible? What if you could slip it to a foreign leader, inducing a breakdown that would discredit him? What if it was the key to unlocking the human mind, to breaking down resistance and implanting new thoughts? The possibilities seemed endless. In the early 1950s, Sidney Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to purchase essentially the world's entire supply of LSD from Sandoz Laboratories. The initial buy was for about $240,000, which in today's money would be well over $4 million. Later, when American pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly developed a method to synthesize LSD more efficiently, in 1954, the CIA became their primary customer. Documents suggest the agency once considered buying 10 kilograms of the drug, enough for 100 million doses. Their goal was twofold: to have an unlimited supply for their own experiments, and to deny that supply to potential enemies. Gottlieb distributed this LSD widely and without discrimination. He sent it to universities, hospitals, prisons, and clinics across America, using front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology to conceal the CIA's involvement. Researchers at these institutions, many of them unaware of the true source of their funding, began experimenting with LSD on human subjects. Some of these subjects were volunteers who signed consent forms, though often without truly understanding what they were agreeing to. But many, perhaps most, had no idea they were being drugged at all. This was not an accident. This was policy. Gottlieb and his colleagues believed that unwitting subjects would provide the most valuable data because they would react as real-world targets would react, with no preparation, no psychological defenses. The results would be authentic. The experiments took many forms, each more disturbing than the last. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a federal facility that was essentially a prison hospital, Dr. Harris Isbell administered LSD to drug-addicted inmates, mostly African-American men. These subjects were told they would receive heroin in exchange for participating in experiments that might help develop a cure for addiction. What they actually received was LSD, often in massive doses, given day after day for extended periods. In one case, 7 men received LSD for 77 consecutive days. The goal was to see what would happen to the human mind under sustained psychedelic assault. Could you induce permanent changes? Could you break someone's personality and rebuild it? The experiment produced no useful intelligence, just human suffering. The men experienced terrifying hallucinations, paranoia that persisted long after the drug wore off, and psychological damage that would last the rest of their lives. At the National Institute of Mental Health Addiction Research Center, researchers followed similar protocols. One patient received LSD continuously for 174 days. He was a mental patient in Kentucky, deemed expendable by the researchers who viewed him as little more than a laboratory animal. The doses were adjusted, the intervals varied, all to see what the breaking point might be. In federal prisons across the country, inmates were offered sentence reductions or extra privileges in exchange for participation in drug studies. Whitey Bulger, who would later become one of Boston's most notorious crime bosses, participated in LSD experiments at the Atlanta Penitentiary in the late 1950s. Decades later, he would describe the experience in vivid, haunting terms. 8 men in a panic state, he said. Total loss of appetite. The room changing shape. Hours of paranoia and violent thoughts. Blood coming out of the walls. Men turning into skeletons before his eyes. He felt, he said, like he was going insane. This was not therapy. This was torture disguised as research. The CIA's interest in LSD extended beyond prisons and hospitals. They wanted to test the drug's effects in real-world scenarios on unsuspecting people going about their normal lives. How would someone react if dosed at a party, in a restaurant, in their own home? Would they remember the experience? Would they reveal secrets? Could you program them while they were in this altered state? These questions led to some of the most reckless experiments in the entire MKUltra program. CIA operatives began dosing each other at office parties, slipping LSD into drinks to see what would happen. It was treated almost as a prank, a dark joke among people who had convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose. The results were sometimes merely uncomfortable, sometimes catastrophic. Men would find themselves gripped by overwhelming fear, convinced they were dying or going insane with no idea why. The agency's own doctors would then observe them, taking notes, treating them as experimental subjects rather than colleagues in distress. But the CIA didn't limit their field testing to willing participants within the agency. They expanded their experiments to include completely unwitting civilians, people who had no connection to intelligence work, who had committed no crime, who simply had the misfortune to cross paths with MKUltra at the wrong moment. This is where the story becomes even darker, if such a thing is possible. Because what we're talking about now is not prisoners who at least had some nominal choice in their participation, not agency employees who understood the risks of their profession, but ordinary Americans who were drugged without their knowledge or consent, purely to satisfy the curiosity of intelligence officials who believed the Cold War justified any means necessary. The technical services staff, under Gottlieb's direction, began maintaining a stable of operatives who would administer drugs in field conditions. They recruited from unusual places, federal narcotics agents, vice cops, people with access to the criminal underworld. These operatives were given vials of LSD and other substances, along with instructions to dose subjects and report on the results. In some cases, this meant slipping drugs into drinks at bars or restaurants. In others, it meant more elaborate operations designed to test multiple variables at once. Could you dose someone, extract information, and leave them with no memory of the encounter? Could you use sex as a tool of manipulation? Could you create a complete intelligence operation around drugging unwitting targets? These questions led to one of MKUltra's most notorious subprojects, an operation so lurid it almost defies belief. The CIA called it Operation Midnight Climax, and it was exactly what the name suggested. George Hunter White was perfect for the job, though perhaps not in any way that reflected well on him. He was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, a hard-drinking, two-fisted cop who'd worked vice and organized crime for years. He knew the underworld, knew how to work informants, knew how to bend rules when the situation demanded it. By the mid-1950s, he was also on the CIA's payroll, working under the pseudonym Morgan Hall. Sidney Gottlieb had recruited him to run a network of safehouses where unwitting subjects could be dosed with drugs and observed without their knowledge. White threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that suggested he found the moral ambiguity exciting rather than troubling. In his diary, he would later write with disturbing glee, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" The first safe house was established in Greenwich Village, New York in 1953, shortly after MKUltra's creation. It was a nondescript apartment at 81 Bedford Street, but inside it had been transformed into a surveillance facility. One-way mirrors lined the walls. Microphones were hidden in the electrical outlets. Cameras were positioned to capture everything that happened in the main room. The furniture was deliberately eclectic, designed to look bohemian and artistic, to put visitors at ease, and the guests were brought in through a simple but effective mechanism: sex. White hired prostitutes, women who worked the streets of the village, and put them on the CIA payroll. They were paid $100 a night, an enormous sum at the time, and given immunity from arrest for prostitution. In exchange, they would lure men, Johns as White called them, back to the Bedford Street apartment. Once there, the men would be offered drinks that had been spiked with LSD or other drugs. Then the prostitutes would try to extract information, engage in post-coital questioning, attempt to learn secrets while the men were under the influence and in a vulnerable state. George White would observe all of this from behind the one-way mirror, sitting on a portable toilet he'd installed so he wouldn't have to leave his observation post, drinking martinis and taking notes. The scene was grotesque, a combination of the ridiculous and the terrible. Here was an agent of the United States government, watching American citizens being drugged and manipulated, treating the whole thing as entertainment. The men brought to the apartment had no idea they were being watched, no idea they'd been dosed with a powerful hallucinogen, no idea that their most private moments were being recorded for a CIA file. They thought they were simply engaging in a commercial sexual transaction. Instead, they'd become unwitting participants in a mind control experiment. In 1955, Operation Midnight Climax expanded to San Francisco. White moved west and set up a new safe house at 225 Chestnut Street in the Telegraph Hill neighborhood. This location was even more elaborate than the Bedford Street apartment. The walls were decorated with posters by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, famous for his paintings of Parisian brothels. There were photographs of women in bondage, pornographic art designed to create an atmosphere of decadence and transgression. The one-way mirrors were larger, the surveillance more sophisticated. Additional safe houses were established in Marin County and at other San Francisco locations. The operation ran for over a decade, from the mid-50s until 1965. During that time, hundreds of men, perhaps thousands, were dosed with LSD and other drugs without their knowledge. They experienced terrifying trips, paranoid episodes, hallucinations that left them questioning their sanity. Some carried out crimes while under the influence, armed robberies and assaults they would have no memory of afterward. When caught, they were prosecuted as criminals, with no one acknowledging that they'd been drugged by their own government. The purpose of Operation Midnight Climax was ostensibly to study whether drugs could be useful in intelligence operations, particularly in compromising foreign officials. Could you use sexual blackmail combined with drug-induced vulnerability to turn an enemy agent? Could you extract secrets from someone who wouldn't remember the conversation? But there was something else going on too. Something darker. The operation seemed designed as much for the entertainment of the men running it as for any legitimate intelligence purpose. White's diaries suggest he enjoyed the voyeurism, the power, the sense that he could do anything without consequences. The prostitutes later reported that CIA operatives would sometimes come to the safe houses just to watch, that the line between research and recreation had essentially dissolved. This was science fiction degenerating into pornography, with real human lives as the cost. In 1962, the CIA's Inspector General, John Ehrman, conducted a review of MKUltra and its various subprojects. His report on Operation Midnight Climax was scathing. He described it as a free-wheeling, illicit criminal operation and strongly recommended it be shut down immediately. The operation, he noted, was not producing useful intelligence. The methodology was scientifically unsound, and the ethical and legal problems were staggering. Drugging unwitting Americans, recording their private sexual activities, potentially blackmailing them. All of this violated both constitutional rights and basic decency. The fact that it was being done by a government agency supposedly dedicated to protecting American freedom made it even worse. But the operation continued for 3 more years, until 1965, before finally being terminated. By then, the damage was done. Lives had been destroyed, trust had been violated, and precedents had been set that would haunt the CIA for decades. While Operation Midnight Climax unfolded in American cities, an even more extensive and damaging series of experiments was taking place north of the border in Montreal, Canada. These experiments would become known as the Montreal experiments, or Subproject 68 of MKUltra, and they represented the program's most sustained attempt to achieve actual mind control, to completely erase a personality and rebuild it from scratch. The man in charge was Dr. Ewen Cameron, and he was, in many ways, the epitome of respectable authority gone terribly wrong. Cameron was born in Scotland in 1901 and trained as a psychiatrist in the British tradition. By the 1940s, he was one of the most prominent figures in North American psychiatry. He'd worked at some of the finest institutions, published extensively, and was widely respected for his innovative approaches to treating mental illness. In 1943, he was invited to McGill University in Montreal to establish a new psychiatric department and take over direction of the Allan Memorial Institute, a psychiatric facility affiliated with the Royal Victoria Hospital. Cameron's reputation was sterling. He'd been one of only 3 psychiatrists chosen to evaluate Rudolf Hess at Nuremberg, helping to determine if Hitler's former deputy was fit to stand trial for war crimes. In 1961, he would become the first president of the World Psychiatric Association. Here was a man at the pinnacle of his profession, someone whose opinions carried enormous weight in medical circles. He was also, it turned out, someone whose ambition and certainty led him to commit acts that today would be recognized as torture. Cameron believed he had discovered a cure for schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses. His theory was based on the idea that mental illness resulted from learned patterns of dysfunctional behavior, patterns that had become so deeply ingrained in the patient's psyche that conventional therapy couldn't reach them. The solution, in Cameron's view, was to erase those patterns completely, to reduce the patient's mind to a blank slate, and then rebuild it with healthy patterns. He called this process depatterning and psychic driving, and he pursued it with an enthusiasm that verged on fanaticism. The depatterning phase was designed to break down existing mental structures. Cameron used every tool at his disposal, and some he invented specifically for this purpose. Electroconvulsive therapy, commonly known as electroshock treatment, was a standard psychiatric tool at the time, typically administered at carefully controlled voltages 2 or 3 times a week. Cameron used it at 30 to 40 times the normal power, and he administered it multiple times per day, every day, for weeks or months at a time. The goal was to induce complete amnesia, to literally shock the memory out of the patient's brain. Between shock sessions, patients were kept in drug-induced comas, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. Cameron used massive doses of barbiturates, combined with drugs like thorazine, to keep patients unconscious for 20 to 22 hours per day. This was called the sleep room, a ward in the Allan Memorial Institute where patients lay in darkness, their consciousness suspended, while their minds presumably reset themselves to some primitive state. Sensory deprivation was another key component. Patients were placed in isolation rooms with their ears plugged, their eyes covered, sometimes restrained so they couldn't move. They were given minimal food and water. In some cases, they were injected with curare, a paralytic drug that left them conscious but unable to move or speak, trapped in their own bodies. The psychological effects of this treatment were catastrophic. Patients emerged from depatterning in a state of profound disorientation, unable to remember their lives, their families, sometimes unable to control basic bodily functions. They would have to be toilet trained again, like infants. They couldn't feed themselves. Many couldn't speak coherently. Cameron considered this a success. In his notes, he would describe bringing patients to stage 3 depatterning, where they had no memory of their past, no sense of identity, just a vague awareness of their immediate surroundings. This, to him, was the blank slate he needed. The next phase was psychic driving, Cameron's method for rebuilding the destroyed psyche. He created tape loops, recorded messages that would play continuously into the patient's ears through headphones. These messages were based on conversations with the patients before depatterning, taking statements they'd made about themselves and transforming them into instructions for the new personality being constructed. A typical psychic driving tape would begin with negative statements, things the patient had said about themselves. You are selfish. You are inadequate. You are weak. These would repeat thousands of times, the patient's own voice condemning them, reinforcing their failures. Then would come positive statements, the new identity being implanted. You are strong. You are capable. You are loving. Back and forth, negative and positive. Sometimes for 16 hours a day, for weeks or months. Some patients were subjected to these tapes for over 100 days of continuous psychic driving. The messages could repeat up to 500,000 times. It was psychological torture of an almost medieval intensity, but Cameron believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough in psychiatric treatment. The funding for Cameron's work came through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, one of the CIA's front organizations. From 1957 to 1964, the agency funneled at least $60,000 to Cameron, though he may have received much more through other channels. Whether Cameron knew the money came from the CIA is unclear. Some historians argue he did know and didn't care, that his own research goals aligned perfectly with the CIA's interest in mind control. Others suggest he was genuinely unaware, that he was so focused on his psychiatric theories that he didn't question where the funding originated. Either way, the results were the same. The CIA gained access to data on extreme techniques for breaking human consciousness, and Cameron got to pursue experiments that no ethical review board would have approved if they'd understood what was actually happening. The patients who underwent Cameron's treatments were not enemy agents or prisoners of war. They were ordinary Canadians who had come to the Allan Memorial Institute seeking help for depression, anxiety, postnatal depression, relatively minor psychiatric issues that should have been treatable with conventional therapy. Instead, they became subjects in experiments that destroyed their lives. One woman, who entered treatment for postpartum depression, emerged unable to recognize her children, unable to remember 25 years of her life. She had to relearn everything: how to read, how to cook, how to maintain basic hygiene. Her daughter later described her mother as emotionally stripped, her personality gone, replaced by someone who could barely function in the world. Another patient, a man who'd come for treatment of work-related stress, lost all memory of his business, his profession, his friends. He couldn't remember his own wedding day. The man his wife had married was simply gone, and in his place was someone who bore his face but had none of his memories, none of his personality. The number of victims is unknown. Cameron's personal files were destroyed after his death. Many hospital records were lost or deliberately concealed, but over 300 people applied for compensation from the Canadian government in the 1990s, suggesting the true number affected was much higher. These people, or their families, because many of the original victims had since died or were too damaged to speak for themselves, testified to lives utterly destroyed by Cameron's experiments. Children who grew up with mothers or fathers who were hollow shells, barely able to function. Spouses who had to care for partners who'd become strangers. And through it all, no apology, no acknowledgement of responsibility, just bureaucratic denials and arguments about legal liability. The Allan Memorial Institute, where the horrors occurred, still stands today. Cameron's portrait hung in its halls for decades, honoring a man who should have been remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. The human toll of MKUltra extended far beyond Montreal and the safehouses of San Francisco. Across America and beyond, people were caught in the machinery of the program, used and discarded, their suffering rationalized as necessary for national security. But one case in particular would haunt the CIA for decades, partly because the victim was one of their own, partly because the circumstances were so bizarre and troubling that they demanded explanation. This was the death of Dr. Frank Olson, and it remains to this day one of the most controversial mysteries in Cold War history. A death that was first called suicide, then reconsidered as murder, then left in a legal limbo where truth seems forever out of reach. Frank Rudolph Emanuel Olson was born in July 1910 in Hurley, Wisconsin, to Swedish immigrant parents. He grew up to become a biochemist, specializing in aerobiology, the study of how diseases spread through the air. This expertise brought him to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the Army maintained its biological warfare laboratories. By the early 1950s, Olson was a civilian employee working as acting chief of the Special Operations Division at Detrick. This position put him at the intersection of military and intelligence work because the Special Operations Division didn't just study biological weapons. It developed them, tested them, and provided expertise to the CIA on how they might be used covertly. Olson had a security clearance that gave him access to some of the government's darkest secrets. He knew about anthrax research, about plague bacteria, about experiments on animals to determine how diseases could be weaponized. And he was beginning to have doubts. In the summer of 1953, Olson traveled to Europe on what was officially described as a routine visit to consult with Allied scientists. But there are suggestions, based on later investigations and testimony from his colleagues, that the trip was more disturbing than that. Some researchers believe Olson witnessed or learned about human experimentation being conducted at CIA black sites, possibly including the testing of biological weapons on unwitting subjects. When he returned to Maryland in November, he was visibly troubled. He talked to his wife about leaving his job, said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he wanted to quit. He was anxious, agitated, not sleeping well. His colleagues noticed the change. He seemed to be wrestling with something, some moral crisis that he couldn't articulate fully. Whether this was connected to what he'd seen in Europe, or to his work at Fort Detrick more generally, or to something else entirely, we'll likely never know with certainty. What we do know is that in mid-November 1953, Frank Olson was invited to a work retreat that would change everything. The retreat was held at a cabin at Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland, November 18th through 20th. It was billed as an informal gathering, a chance for CIA and Army personnel to relax, bond, discuss work in a casual setting, away from the pressures of the office. About a dozen men attended, a mixture of Special Operations Division staff from Fort Detrick and Technical Services staff from the CIA, including Sidney Gottlieb and his deputy Robert Lashbrook. On the kid's second night of the retreat, Wednesday the 18th, after dinner, Gottlieb broke out a bottle of Cointreau. He poured glasses for everyone and proposed a toast. What none of the Fort Detrick men knew was that Gottlieb had spiked the liqueur with LSD. About 20 minutes after everyone had drunk, Gottlieb informed them what he'd done. "I've just given you LSD," he announced, and proceeded to explain what the drug was and what they might expect to feel. The reaction among the dosed men was mixed. Some found the experience interesting, even pleasant. They laughed at the strange sensations, the visual distortions, the way time seemed to slow down or speed up. But Frank Olson had a very different response. He became anxious, then paranoid. He believed he'd made a fool of himself at the retreat, that his colleagues had seen him act erratically and now thought less of him. This fear intensified in the days following the retreat. By the time he returned home that Friday, he was in a state of acute psychological distress. He couldn't sleep. He paced the house. He told his wife that he felt he'd made terrible mistakes in his work, that he wanted to resign. Olson's supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruett, noticed the deterioration and contacted the CIA. Gottlieb suggested that Olson should see a doctor, but not just any doctor. He should see Dr. Harold Abramson, a New York physician who was under contract with the CIA to conduct LSD research. Abramson was not a psychiatrist, but he knew about LSD. And more importantly, he could be trusted to keep the CIA's involvement secret. On Monday, November the 23rd, Ruett and Lashbrook took Olson to New York to see Abramson. The consultation did nothing to ease Olson's distress. If anything, it seemed to make things worse. Abramson prescribed sedatives but offered little in the way of actual psychiatric care. Over the next few days, Olson's condition continued to decline. He called his wife, told her he was coming home. Then he changed his mind, said he needed to stay in New York for treatment. Ruett returned to Maryland, leaving Olson in Lashbrook's care. On Thursday, November the 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Olson and Lashbrook checked into the Hotel Statler in Midtown Manhattan, room 1018A on the 13th floor. They went to see Abramson again, and he recommended that Olson be committed to a psychiatric facility, suggesting Chestnut Lodge in Maryland. That evening, Olson and Lashbrook returned to the hotel. They watched television, had dinner, returned to the room. Olson washed his socks in the sink. Around 10 in the evening, he went to bed. Lashbrook stayed up reading. Around 2:30 in the morning, Lashbrook heard a loud crash, the sound of breaking glass. He looked up from his book to see that the window was shattered and Frank Olson was gone. Olson's body was found on the sidewalk below, 13 stories down, multiple fractures, massive trauma. He was 43 years old when police arrived. Lashbrook told them Olson had been suffering from depression, that the fall was a suicide. The death was processed as such. Olson's family was told he'd had a nervous breakdown and jumped from the window. His body was placed in a sealed casket and buried quickly. His wife, Alice, was strongly discouraged from viewing the body, told that the injuries were too severe, that it would only cause her additional trauma. She accepted this explanation, at least outwardly. What else could she do? Her husband had worked in classified programs. His death had been ruled a suicide by authorities. There was no reason at that time to suspect anything more sinister. The Olson family mourned and tried to move on, telling themselves and others that Frank had died from a fatal nervous breakdown, a euphemism that concealed as much as it revealed. 22 years passed. The Olson children grew up with the story of their father's suicide, a tragedy, but a comprehensible one. Then, in June 1975, the world learned about MKUltra. The Rockefeller Commission, established by President Gerald Ford to investigate CIA abuses, published a report that included a brief mention of an army scientist who'd been given LSD without his knowledge in 1953 and had died a week later. The report didn't name him, but the details were specific enough that reporters were able to identify Frank Olson. Suddenly, the story was on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Olson family, blindsided by this revelation, learned that Frank hadn't simply had a breakdown. He'd been drugged by the CIA as part of an experiment. The suicide that had shaped their lives for over 2 decades was revealed to have been preceded by dosing Frank with a powerful hallucinogen without his consent. The government response was swift, but it reeked of damage control rather than genuine accountability. Within 10 days of the story breaking, the Olson family was invited to the White House. President Ford personally apologized to Alice Olson and her children, expressing regret for what had happened. William Colby, the CIA director, also apologized. Congress quickly authorized a settlement, $750,000 for the family, a substantial sum, in exchange for a waiver of their right to sue the government. The Olsons accepted the money and the apology. It seemed like closure, or at least the best closure they were likely to get. But the story wouldn't stay closed. In 1994, Eric Olson, Frank's son, who'd been 9 years old when his father died, made a decision that would reopen the entire case. He had his father's body exhumed for a second autopsy. The original medical examiner's report from 1953 had noted cuts and abrasions on the body, consistent with a fall through broken glass, but it hadn't been particularly thorough. Forensic science had advanced considerably in the intervening 40 years, and Eric wanted a modern examination. What the new autopsy revealed was shocking. There was a hematoma on Frank Olson's skull, a blow to the head that predated the fall. The pattern of injuries was not entirely consistent with a fall from a window. Most damningly, the forensic pathologist who conducted the examination concluded that the evidence suggested Frank Olson had been struck in the head before going through the window. In other words, this might not have been a suicide at all. It might have been murder. This revelation transformed the case from a tragedy of bureaucratic callousness to a possible homicide. Eric Olson began investigating in earnest, tracking down witnesses, obtaining documents through Freedom of Information Act requests, piecing together what had really happened at the Hotel Statler on that November night in 1953. He discovered that Robert Lashbrook's behavior after the fall had been bizarre. Lashbrook hadn't left the room immediately. He'd made a phone call saying cryptically, "He's gone," before reporting the incident to the hotel. He'd given conflicting accounts of whether the window had been open or closed. And there were other troubling details. A CIA document from the 1970s mentioned that George Hunter White, the man who ran Operation Midnight Climax, had been in New York that night and had been given responsibility for watching Olson, though he'd had to leave the city to care for his mother. This suggested that Olson was considered enough of a security risk that the CIA had assigned him a minder, someone to make sure he didn't talk about classified programs. The possibility that emerges from this evidence, though it remains unproven and unprovable, given the destruction of documents and the death of most witnesses, is deeply disturbing. Frank Olson, after his LSD experience, may have been planning to resign from his position at Fort Detrick and potentially to reveal information about biological weapons research or other classified programs. This would have made him a security threat. The CIA, facing the possibility that someone with access to their darkest secrets might go public, may have decided that the risk was unacceptable. According to this theory, someone, possibly CIA personnel, entered the hotel room that night and threw Frank Olson through the window to silence him. Lashbrook would have been complicit, or at minimum, aware of what was happening. The suicide story was a cover, and it held for over 20 years because no one had reason to question the official narrative. The Olson family filed a new lawsuit in 2012, alleging wrongful death and seeking a proper investigation. But in 2013, the case was dismissed. The judge cited the earlier settlement and the statute of limitations. However, in his decision, U.S. District Judge James Boasberg wrote something remarkable. While the court must limit its analysis to the four corners of the complaint, he noted, "The skeptical reader may wish to know that the public record supports many of the allegations in the family's suit, far-fetched as they may sound." In other words, even while dismissing the case on technical grounds, The judge was acknowledging that there was credible evidence Frank Olson's death was not a suicide. The New York District Attorney's Office reopened the case and changed the cause of death from suicide to unknown, but no criminal charges have ever been filed. The truth about what happened in room 1018A at the Hotel Statler remains officially a mystery. But for anyone familiar with the broader history of MKUltra, with the CIA's willingness to sacrifice individuals for perceived security needs, with the culture of secrecy and deniability that permeated the agency, the conclusion seems unavoidable even if unprovable. Frank Olson knew too much, and he died for it. The Frank Olson case was extraordinary in its notoriety, but the pattern of suffering it exemplified was distressingly common throughout MKUltra's 2-decade run. Across the United States and Canada, countless individuals, most of them never identified, never compensated, never acknowledged, were damaged or destroyed by experiments they never consented to, and often never knew about. The full scope of the human wreckage is impossible to calculate, partly because records were destroyed, partly because many victims never came forward, partly because the damage was sometimes delayed or attributed to other causes. But the fragments we can piece together paint a picture of casual cruelty inflicted on the vulnerable and the powerless, all in the name of national security and scientific progress. Consider the case of Harold Blower, a professional tennis player suffering from depression after a divorce. In 1953, he checked himself into the New York State Psychiatric Institute seeking treatment. Instead, he became an unwitting subject in Army-funded experiments, injected with massive doses of mescaline and related compounds. After the 5th injection, Blower went into convulsions and died. His family was told he'd had a reaction to routine medication. The truth only emerged in 1975 during the congressional investigations. The Army had been testing the drugs under a contract related to chemical warfare research. Blower's death was covered up for over 20 years. Or consider the mentally disabled children at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts. In the 1940s and 50s, researchers from MIT and Harvard fed these children radioactive oatmeal as part of nutrition studies, telling the boys they were joining a science club that would give them special privileges. The children and their parents were never informed that the oatmeal contained radioactive traces. This wasn't technically MKUltra. It was part of related atomic energy research, but it exemplified the same mindset, that certain populations, the institutionalized, the imprisoned, the mentally ill, could be treated as lab animals because they lacked the power or understanding to object. The boys ate their radioactive breakfast with enthusiasm, proud to be part of something that sounded important, never knowing they were being used as human guinea pigs. James Whitey Bulger's experience at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was typical of how prisoners were exploited. He and other inmates were told they were participating in research to find a cure for schizophrenia. In reality, they were being given LSD to see what would happen under prolonged exposure. Bulger later described 18 months of hell, trips that lasted for days, paranoia that never quite went away even after the drug wore off. He felt, he said, like he was being driven insane deliberately. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, he wrote decades later. Total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls, guys turning to skeletons in front of me. These men had signed consent forms, but they had been misled about the nature of the experiments, and the choice was illusory anyway. Sign the form and receive privileges or time off your sentence, or refuse and face the full weight of your punishment. That's not meaningful consent. That's coercion. The unwitting dosing of civilians in public places left a trail of damaged lives that will never be fully documented. People who went to bars and restaurants, who accepted drinks from strangers, who woke up the next day unable to remember what had happened, terrified they'd had a psychotic break or were losing their minds. Some were dosed multiple times by different operatives who didn't coordinate their activities. Some experienced lasting psychological damage, paranoia and anxiety that persisted for years. And they had no recourse because they didn't know what had been done to them. If they sought psychiatric help, they were treated as people with underlying mental illness, not as victims of government experimentation. The whole system was designed to obscure culpability, to ensure that even if something went wrong, the CIA could maintain plausible deniability. The university researchers who participated in MKUltra, often without knowing the CIA was funding their work, also contributed to the human cost. At Tulane University in New Orleans, Dr. Robert Heath conducted experiments involving the implantation of electrodes directly into patients' brains, then stimulating different regions to see if behavior could be controlled. At the University of Oklahoma, researchers experimented with sensory deprivation tanks, keeping subjects isolated for extended periods to see if they could be made more suggestible. At numerous other institutions, professors and graduate students carried out research that would never have been approved if the Basui, true funding source and purpose, had been disclosed. Some of these researchers later expressed remorse. Others defended their work, arguing that they genuinely believed they were advancing psychiatric knowledge, that the CIA's involvement was incidental. But intention doesn't erase consequences. The work was done. The damage was inflicted. And the victims, to the extent they were identified at all, received minimal acknowledgement or compensation. By the late 1960s, MKUltra was winding down, not because of ethical concerns, but because it had failed. After nearly 15 years of experiments, millions of dollars spent, countless lives disrupted or destroyed, the CIA had not discovered a reliable method for controlling the human mind. LSD, which had seemed so promising, turned out to be too unpredictable. You couldn't control someone's experience on the drug, couldn't guarantee they'd become suggestible or reveal information. More often, they just became confused and frightened, hardly ideal for intelligence gathering. The more extreme techniques, like Cameron's depatterning, destroyed minds but couldn't rebuild them according to any useful template. The Manchurian candidate, the programmed assassin who could be activated with a code word, remained firmly in the realm of fiction. In 1962, Richard Helms, then Deputy Director for Plans, wrote an internal memo acknowledging that the program was not yielding the expected results. In 1964, MKUltra was officially redesignated as MK Search, with a narrower focus on finding agents that could be used covertly in field operations. But even this truncated program limped along without major breakthroughs. By 1973, the landscape had changed dramatically. Richard Nixon was president, mired in the Watergate scandal that would eventually force his resignation. The CIA was under increasing scrutiny, not just for domestic surveillance, but for a litany of past abuses that were beginning to surface. Richard Helms, who'd been CIA director since 1966, was fired in February 1973 for refusing to help the White House cover up Watergate. As one of his final acts before leaving office, Helms made a decision that would haunt the agency for decades. He ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. Sidney Gottlieb, who was himself planning to retire after 22 years with the CIA, helped carry out this order. Together, Helms and Gottlieb ensured that 7 boxes of MKUltra records, the core documents detailing the program's experiments and findings, were shredded and burned. The chief of the CIA Records Center protested, arguing that destroying the files violated agency policy and might constitute obstruction of justice, but the order came from the director himself, and it was carried out. The motivation for this destruction was transparently self-serving. Helms and Gottlieb knew that if the program ever became public, they would face serious legal and political consequences. Better to eliminate the evidence and rely on the faulty memories of aging bureaucrats than to leave a paper trail that could be followed by investigators. This was not about national security. No foreign adversary was going to be helped by knowing the CIA had conducted mind control experiments that largely failed. This was about covering up crimes, protecting reputations, and avoiding accountability. And it very nearly worked. For 2 years, the secrets held. Then, in December 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times under the headline, "Huge CIA Operation Reported in U.S. Against Anti-War Forces, Other Dissidents in Nixon Years." Hersh revealed that the CIA had conducted massive illegal domestic surveillance operations, including experiments on American citizens. The article was based on leaked internal CIA documents, including portions of the Family Jewels, a compilation of agency abuses that had been assembled internally but never meant for public consumption. The Hersh article triggered immediate political repercussions. Congress, which had largely allowed the CIA to operate without serious oversight for decades, suddenly faced enormous pressure to investigate. President Gerald Ford, who'd succeeded Nixon after his resignation, established the Rockefeller Commission in January 1975 to investigate CIA activities within the United States. The commission was chaired by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller and included prominent establishment figures. From the beginning, there were concerns it would be a whitewash, an establishment protecting itself. Those concerns were partially justified. The Rockefeller Commission's report, released in June 1975, was relatively limited in scope, but it did reveal the existence of MKUltra and mentioned the Frank Olson case, which opened the floodgates. Once MKUltra was publicly acknowledged, Congress moved to conduct its own investigation, one that would prove far more thorough and damaging to the CIA's reputation. The United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, better known as the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho, began its work in January 1975. Over the next year and a half, the committee would investigate not just MKUltra, but a range of intelligence abuses, assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic surveillance of American citizens, coups and interventions in other countries' affairs. The committee had subpoena power and was determined to use it. They demanded documents, even though most MKUltra records had been destroyed. They called witnesses, including Sidney Gottlieb himself, who was subpoenaed to testify in October 1975. The hearings were conducted mostly in secret, given the classified nature of the material, but portions were released to the public, and they were devastating. Gottlieb's testimony, which remained classified for decades but has since been partially released, revealed a man who'd convinced himself that his work had been justified by the threat America faced during the Cold War. He acknowledged that unwitting testing had occurred, but downplayed its significance. He admitted that the program had largely failed to achieve its objectives. The results of everything told us that the money expended, the effort expended, the security risk involved, when you add everything up, it was probably not a high payoff program, he told the committee. This was a remarkable admission. After 2 decades, millions of dollars, and countless ruined lives, the CIA's own assessment was that MKUltra had been essentially useless for its stated purpose. But Gottlieb showed little remorse. He'd been following orders, serving his country, operating under the assumption that the Soviets were doing worse and America had to keep pace. In his worldview, the suffering of individuals was regrettable but necessary. The committee members were less forgiving. They pressed him on the ethical implications, on the violation of constitutional rights, on the hypocrisy of an agency supposedly defending freedom while conducting experiments that stripped away human dignity. Gottlieb deflected, obfuscated, claimed not to remember details, or cited national security concerns. The Church Committee's final report, published in April 1976, was a landmark document in American political history. Across 6 books and multiple volumes of hearings, it laid out a comprehensive picture of intelligence community abuses that shocked the nation. MKUltra was just one chapter, but it was among the most disturbing. The report documented the scope of the program, the universities and hospitals that had participated, the types of experiments conducted, and the complete absence of meaningful oversight. It confirmed that the CIA had drugged unwitting American citizens, that prisoners and mental patients had been used as experimental subjects without consent, that at least one person, Frank Olson, had died as a direct result of the experiments. The committee made several recommendations designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. Proper oversight mechanisms, restrictions on human experimentation, requirements for informed consent, prohibitions on testing drugs on unwitting subjects. Many of these recommendations were eventually incorporated into executive orders and legislation, but the Church Committee's work was hampered by the destruction of records. They had to rely on the memories of participants, on the small number of documents that survived because they'd been misfiled with financial records, and on circumstantial evidence. This meant that the full story could never be told. How many people were subjected to experiments? The committee estimated it was in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands, but the exact number would never be known. What were all the subprojects? MKUltra included over 150 separate research initiatives, many of which remain obscure or completely unknown because the records were destroyed. Were there deaths besides Frank Olson? Almost certainly, but proving causation decades after the fact, with no documentation, was nearly impossible. The destruction of evidence, ironically, became one of the most condemning facts about the program. If the CIA had nothing to hide, why destroy the records? The very act of destruction implied consciousness of guilt, an acknowledgement that what had been done could not withstand public scrutiny. The aftermath of the Church Committee investigations was complex and ultimately unsatisfying for most involved. President Ford issued Executive Order 11905 in February 1976, which banned political assassinations and included provisions restricting experimentation on humans without informed consent. Subsequent executive orders under Carter and Reagan expanded these protections. Congress created permanent intelligence committees to provide ongoing oversight, ending the era when the CIA could operate with virtually no accountability. These were significant reforms, and they did help prevent some of the worst abuses from recurring. But they also came with a significant limitation. They were not retroactive. They couldn't undo the damage already done, couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't restore the shattered minds and broken families. And they didn't include any mechanism for punishing those responsible for past crimes. Sidney Gottlieb was never prosecuted. After retiring from the CIA in 1973, he and his wife moved to India for several years, where he worked in a leper colony, an act of service that he perhaps saw as atonement, though he never publicly expressed regret for his CIA work. When he returned to the United States, he lived quietly in Virginia, largely avoiding public attention. He died in March 1999 at age 80. His obituary in the New York Times called him a kind of genius, striving to explore the frontiers of the human mind for his country, while searching for religious and spiritual meaning in his life. Others were less charitable. One obituary called him pusher, assassin, and pimp, comparing him to the worst figures of the 20th century. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Gottlieb was a brilliant chemist who allowed his patriotism and his belief in American exceptionalism to override his moral compass. He convinced himself that the end justified any means, that protecting America from the Soviet threat was worth any cost in human suffering. He was wrong, but he was never forced to acknowledge it publicly or pay any legal price for his actions. Richard Helms fared slightly worse, but only slightly. In 1977, he was convicted of lying to Congress about CIA activities in Chile, specifically about the agency's role in undermining Salvador Allende's government. He received a suspended sentence and a fine, which conservative supporters helped him pay. This made him the only CIA director ever convicted of misleading Congress, though the charge had nothing to do with MKUltra. He died in October 2002, having spent his final decades defending the CIA's actions during his tenure. Neither Gottlieb nor Helms ever expressed meaningful remorse for MKUltra. They'd served their country, in their view, and the judgments of later generations, from the safety of a world that hadn't faced the Soviet threat, were irrelevant. For the victims, justice was much harder to come by. A few managed to win compensation through lawsuits or settlements, but the process was lengthy, expensive, and often humiliating. They had to prove they'd been part of the program, which was difficult when most records had been destroyed. They had to demonstrate lasting harm, convincing skeptical judges and juries that problems appearing years or decades after the experiments were caused by those experiments rather than by other factors. And they had to overcome government lawyers who deployed every possible defense: sovereign immunity, statute of limitations, national security concerns, arguments that the experiments, while regrettable, had been conducted in good faith under the laws and ethical standards of the time. This last argument was particularly galling. The experiments violated the Nuremberg Code, which had been established in 1947 after the trials of Nazi doctors. The code explicitly stated that voluntary informed consent was absolutely essential for any human experimentation. MKUltra began in 1953, 6 years after Nuremberg. The CIA knew what the ethical standards were. They simply chose to ignore them. In 1988, 9 victims of Cameron's experiments in Montreal won a lawsuit against the CIA. They received $67,000 each in an out-of-court settlement, with the CIA accepting no liability. It was a victory of sorts, but a bittersweet one. The money couldn't undo decades of suffering, couldn't restore lost memories or damaged relationships. And for every person who won compensation, there were dozens or hundreds who received nothing, either because they couldn't prove their case, because they'd missed deadlines, or because they simply gave up after years of fighting the government's legal machine. In Canada, the situation was even worse. The Canadian government, which had also funded Cameron's work through grants from its Department of National Health and Welfare, initially refused to acknowledge any responsibility. It wasn't until 1992 that Canada established a compensation program, and even then, it was restrictive. 77 people received 100,000 Canadian dollars each, but over 200 yuan, and 50 applicants were denied, told they hadn't suffered enough, or couldn't produce adequate medical records, or had applied too late. No one from the Canadian government has ever issued a formal apology. McGill University, where the experiments took place, has acknowledged that Cameron worked there, but maintains he was an independent contractor, not their employee, and therefore they bear no legal responsibility. The psychological scars extended beyond the direct victims to their families. Children grew up with parents who'd been broken by the experiments, who couldn't provide normal parental care, who were haunted by what had been done to them. Spouses became caregivers for partners who'd become strangers. Siblings watched as brothers or sisters struggled with paranoia, depression, and other mental health issues that might have been caused or exacerbated by their unwitting participation in MKUltra. These secondary victims, the ripple effects of the program, are impossible to quantify but no less real. Some families were destroyed completely. Divorces, estrangements, suicides. The full human cost of MKUltra will never be calculated, but it's far larger than the number of people who were directly experimented upon. The legacy of MKUltra extends into our present moment in ways both obvious and subtle. On the most direct level, it established precedents in medical ethics and government accountability that continue to shape policy. The regulations requiring informed consent for human experimentation, the oversight boards that review research protocols, the restrictions on classified research involving human subjects, all of these can be traced back in part to the revelations about MKUltra. The program became a cautionary tale taught in medical schools and law schools, an example of what happens when scientists and government officials lose sight of fundamental ethical principles in pursuit of national security or scientific advancement. Every researcher who works with human subjects now must grapple with the ghost of MKUltra, must ensure their work doesn't cross the lines that Gottlieb and Cameron crossed so casually. But the legacy extends beyond formal policy. MKUltra fundamentally damaged public trust in government institutions, particularly the intelligence community. Before the 1970s, most Americans had a generally positive view of the CIA, seeing it as a necessary bulwark against Soviet expansion, staffed by patriots defending freedom. The revelation that this same agency had been conducting mind control experiments on unwitting citizens shattered that narrative. It revealed an institution that saw American citizens as potential test subjects, that prioritized secrecy over accountability, that would lie and destroy evidence to cover up its crimes. This revelation came during the same period as Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, and other disclosures that undermined faith in government honesty. MKUltra was part of a broader collapse of the post-World War II consensus, the end of an era when Americans largely trusted their government to act in their best interests. The program also fed into conspiracy theories that continue to flourish today. When you learn that the government really did conduct secret mind control experiments, really did dose unwitting citizens with drugs, really did collaborate with Nazi scientists and cover up deaths, it becomes harder to dismiss other conspiracy theories as paranoid fantasies. If MKUltra was real, what else might be real? This has led to a broader erosion of the boundary between legitimate skepticism and unfounded conspiracy thinking, a problem that continues to plague American political discourse. The government's own documented abuses provide ammunition for those who claim every mass shooting is a false flag, every terrorist attack is an inside job, every unexplained event is evidence of hidden government machinations. The irony is bitter. The CIA's real crimes have made it harder to have rational conversations about what the government actually does and doesn't do. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to seek justice and acknowledgement for MKUltra's victims. In 2019, a class action lawsuit was filed in Canada on behalf of victims of the Montreal experiments, naming the Canadian government, McGill University, and the Royal Victoria Hospital as defendants. In July 2025, a Quebec judge authorized the lawsuit to proceed, a significant victory after decades of legal stonewalling. The plaintiffs are seeking not just compensation, but an official apology and a full accounting of what happened at the Allan Memorial Institute. Whether they'll succeed remains to be seen. The Canadian government continues to argue it bears no legal liability, that the experiments were conducted by an independent contractor, that too much time has passed. These arguments ring hollow morally, even if they have legal merit. The government funded the research. The government benefited from the results. The government has a moral obligation to acknowledge what was done in its name and to provide some measure of justice to the victims and their families. In the United States, there have been parallel efforts, though the legal landscape is even more challenging. The federal government has sovereign immunity for most torts, meaning you can't sue unless the government consents. Veterans who were experimented upon as part of MKUltra have tried to seek compensation through the VA disability system, arguing that the experiments were incident to service, and therefore the lasting damage should be treated as a service-connected disability. Some have succeeded, others have been denied. The lack of documentation, thanks to Helms and Gottlieb's destruction of records, makes it nearly impossible to prove a claim decades after the fact. And the government continues to fight, spending far more on legal fees to resist compensation than it would cost to simply acknowledge responsibility and provide restitution. The question of why this matters, why we should care about experiments that ended over 50 years ago, is worth addressing. Some would argue that MKUltra is ancient history, that the Cold War context that produced it is long gone, that the people responsible are mostly dead, that we should move on. This argument misses the fundamental point. MKUltra matters because it reveals something essential about power and accountability. It shows what happens when institutions are allowed to operate in secret with minimal oversight. It demonstrates how easily ethical boundaries can be crossed when those in charge convince themselves the stakes are high enough. It proves that well-educated, respected professionals, scientists and doctors and government officials can commit terrible acts when they believe they're serving a greater good. These lessons are not historical curiosities. They're warnings about dangers that remain present. The MKUltra program was not the work of a few bad apples. It was a systematic, approved, funded operation that involved hundreds of people across dozens of institutions over 2 decades. The experiments were reviewed by supervisors, reported in progress updates, discussed in meetings. This was bureaucracy at work, the banality of evil in its most literal sense. People went to work each day, conducted their experiments, filed their reports, collected their paychecks, and went home to their families, never quite confronting the full horror of what they were participating in. This is how atrocities happen in modern societies, not through the actions of monsters, but through the accumulated decisions of ordinary people who fragment their moral responsibility, who tell themselves they're just following orders or conducting research or serving their country. If it could happen then, in America, at prestigious universities and government agencies, it can happen again. Understanding MKUltra is understanding the mechanisms by which a democratic society can betray its own values. There's also a more specific concern. The techniques developed during MKUltra, though they failed to achieve reliable mind control, were refined and deployed in other contexts. The CIA's interrogation methods, used at black sites during the War on Terror, incorporated lessons from MKUltra research: sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, isolation, the use of fear and disorientation to break down psychological resistance. These techniques have clear lineage to the mind control experiments of the 50s and 60s. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report on CIA torture, released in 2014, revealed that the agency had consulted MKUltra research when developing its enhanced interrogation program. The ghosts of Sidney Gottlieb and Ewen Cameron thus haunt not just the past but the present, their work continuing to influence how America treats those it deems enemies or security threats. This makes understanding MKUltra not just historically important, but practically urgent. The abuses of the past inform the abuses of the present and will shape the abuses of the future if we don't learn the right lessons. The story of MKUltra is ultimately a story about fear. Fear of the Soviet Union, fear of communism, fear of falling behind in an arms race that extended even to the human mind. That fear drove intelligent, educated people to commit acts they might otherwise have recognized as monstrous. It led them to experiment on the vulnerable, to destroy lives in pursuit of an elusive advantage, to sacrifice fundamental values in the name of security. And when the experiments failed, when it became clear that mind control was not achievable through the methods they were using, The fear transformed into a different kind. Fear of exposure, fear of accountability, fear of what the public would think if they learned what had been done in their name. So the records were destroyed, the victims were ignored, and the whole sordid story was buried as deeply as possible. It took investigative journalists, congressional committees, and persistent victims refusing to be silenced to bring the truth into the light. And even now, 50 years after the Church Committee, the full truth remains elusive, hidden behind redacted documents, sealed files, and the simple fact that most of the evidence was deliberately burned. What we're left with is a fragmentary record of one of American intelligence's darkest chapters. We know enough to understand the broad outlines, to grasp the scale of the abuse, to identify some of the victims and perpetrators. But we'll never know everything. We'll never know all the people who were dosed, all the experiments that were conducted, all the damage that was inflicted. The destruction of records ensured that, and that itself is part of the legacy. The cover-up is almost as important as the crime, because it demonstrates the lengths to which powerful institutions will go to protect themselves, even at the cost of justice for their victims. MKUltra stands as a monument to the dangers of secrecy, of unchecked power, of the belief that national security can justify any transgression. These dangers haven't disappeared. If anything, in an age of massive surveillance capabilities, drone warfare, and AI systems that can analyze human behavior in ways Gottlieb never dreamed of, the need to remember and learn from MKUltra is more urgent than ever. The victims of MKUltra deserve more than they've received. They deserve full disclosure, comprehensive compensation, and most importantly, genuine acknowledgement of what was done to them. They deserve to have their government admit, without qualification or legal hedging, that they were wronged, that crimes were committed, that no amount of Cold War context can excuse or justify the violation of their rights and dignity. They deserve to have
the institutions that participated, the universities and hospitals and research centres, acknowledge their role and commit to ensuring such abuses never happen again. And they deserve to have the broader public understand what happened, not as a historical curiosity or conspiracy theory, but as a stark warning about the fragility of ethical constraints when power believes itself threatened. Whether they'll ever receive these things remains uncertain, but the effort to seek justice, to tell the story, to refuse to let MKUltra be forgotten or minimized continues. And it must continue, because the alternative is to accept that governments can abuse their citizens with impunity, that secrecy can permanently shield wrongdoing, that the powerful never have to answer for their crimes. That acceptance would be its own kind of victory for the mentality that created MKUltra in the first place. If you found this exploration of MKUltra's dark history valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Whispering Wars. These stories of forgotten conflicts, hidden histories, and the human costs of political decisions deserve to be told and remembered. By supporting this channel, you help ensure that these important narratives reach a wider audience, that the victims are remembered, and that the lessons of history are not lost. The past is never really past. It echoes in our present and shapes our future. Understanding programs like MKUltra is essential to understanding ourselves, our government, and the eternal tension between security and liberty, between national interest and human rights. Thank you for listening. Remember to like, subscribe, and share if you want to see more content like this. These stories matter, and your engagement helps keep them alive.